I'm the director of Project Zug, and I am so excited to welcome you back here tonight for our concluding lecture of our Pesach cycle. I hope that you had an incredible experience over the past 4 weeks learning with your chavruta. And before we dive into our learning, I want to reintroduce my colleague, Aviva Abulafia, who is our Project Zug user coordinator, who has been working tirelessly over the past few weeks, 4 weeks, longer than that, to make sure that you all have a wonderful experience and all of your questions are answered and all of the tech issues are taken care of. And so I want to reiterate and give her a very hearty round of applause and thank you for all of her hard work. And I will pass it to Aviva to say a few words before we get started with our learning.
Thank you, Allie. Hi, everyone. It's been such a pleasure to get to email with so many of you and get to recognize most of your names on here. I'm so excited to be embarking into Pesach together. And before I introduce Rav Aviva Richman, I wanted to start us off with a couple of things, little prompts to write in the chat. The first one is, where are you from? Just write in the chat where you're zooming in from. There's so many of us here from across time zones and countries and states, and I think it will be really special to just see a map of where everyone's coming from. We have Brooklyn, Seattle, Worcester, Providence, Madison, Wisconsin, Durham, North Carolina. You can scroll through and see all of the different places from across the country. We are a geographically diverse population, and I know there are people here from other countries as well, maybe not in this Zoom, but who will be watching and we're learning with us. And for our next, you can keep writing in, but our next prompt before we start the lecture is write something in the chat that your chavruta maybe said during your learning or that you came up with together, something that your chavruta taught you or said during your learning together that's staying with you and that you're still thinking about and that you really would like to share or lift up. So take a second to maybe jot that down in the chat, something that you're taking away from this learning you did with your chavruta. I'd love to see that. I think it'll be really special for us to see because that's really what this Project Zug is all about. It's about sharing our learning with each other. Okay, wow. Seeing God in everyone. Change is good. Mashiach now. Making places important. Naseh v'nishma. These are amazing. And I really encourage you to keep writing these, sharing these with us. I'm really excited to be able to read these. So let's take another few moments to share these and peruse these. They're really amazing mutuality between us and God. God needs us. Service is a love language. These are really beautiful. And with this intention setting, this bracha that's sending us into our learning and into our Pesach preparation, I'm going to pass it to our teacher and our leader this evening, Rabbi Aviva Richman.
Hi, good evening. It's so great to be with all of you and saw so many of you before you were embarking on this learning journey. Great to see you all now, and seeing all these comments flying in is just so gratifying, and knowing that there was so much learning happening with all of you, and I wish I could have been a fly on the wall in all of your chavrutas. I also want to say we're preparing for Pesach, and it's like a big deal to take some time out of the learning, to take some time over the past month to do the learning, but especially this week when it's just a few nights away, to prepare in a spiritual, emotional, soulful way, and not just making sure you have all those boxes of matzah. It's a big testament to some real dedication and investment. So thank you for inspiring me and each other in that. We did a course that was the Seder and the Song of Songs, a love story in 4 scenes. Our first class together before you embarked on that was a prologue to look at what's some of the backstory before embarking on that relationship with God. And today, no surprise, it's going to be an epilogue. And I would say if there's nothing else that you get out of this session this evening, the main point for this evening, and what I kind of want you to bring with you into your Seder in just a couple of nights and year after year, is we have to write the next chapter each year. We have to play out, articulate, explore what's the next scene. So everything you saw until now was building up through the stories of the Exodus, starting from Seder night, that first night in the depths and the darkness of Egypt, when nothing yet had changed and there was only that little plant or seed of an idea that things could change. The miracle of the sea, but also that stress of the sea being stuck between the Egyptian camp and the sea. You saw Sinai, a moment of a real articulation of commitment, and then finally that scene of building that Mishkan, creating a home as maybe the next formative moment. The story doesn't end there. The story doesn't end at all. And so what the kind of impetus behind framing Seder night as a love story, as telling our love story, is framing that in terms of how did we fall in love with God, how do we trace the origins of other deep relationships in our lives, and how there can be such a desire to look ahead and even to just sit in the present and write that next chapter, right? What is the next chapter in the story? And I think maybe this year more than other years, but I'm sure every year, that means integrating what has happened in our lives since last Passover, since the last time we told the story of what this whole embarking on a relationship with God is about. Telling that next chapter is reflecting on and integrating all of the complexity, the highs and the lows, the insights, the confusions of the past year into this love story as well. So what we're going to do this evening is in some ways not at all creative or interesting. We're just going to go on in that midrash that you've been studying for the past month on one verse from the Song of Songs. That's about 2 flowers, Chavatzelet HaSharon, and Shoshana Ta'amakim, right? That rose of Sharon, lily of the valley. And this whole session is just a lot of commentary on that verse and that poetic image. We're going to see that there's a lot more in this midrash. And through that, I hope we'll find that there is so much more to tell in our story of what it means to be in relationship with God, what it means to be in deep relationship in our lives in general. Okay, wow, this is amazing. Somebody had chavrutas who are Sharon and Shoshana. That's awesome. Okay. You're welcome to continue populating the chat with any insights that you took from your learning, especially one that you might have learned from a chavruta. And I'm gonna shift to sharing my screen so we can continue to learn this midrash together. Okay, here we go. The Seder and the Song of Songs, a love story epilogue. Subtitle, In the Shadow of Our Times. In the Shadow of Our Times. So you've seen now 4 scenes that are described as tzel, chavuya betzel, being hidden / sheltered in shade / shadow, right? The comfort and the darker side of each of those moments. We're going to look now at the shadow of our own times. Okay, here we go. So, the next scene that should look familiar structurally just brings this verse and this concept being hidden in the shadow to our next moment. So just as a review, your Midrash started, Ani chavatzalet Sharon, I am a rose of Sharon. The congregation of Israel said, I am she, and beloved am I. Ani hiva chaviva ani. It is I whom the Holy Blessed One loved out of all the 70 nations. This is the introduction to the 4 scenes that you went on to explore. And certainly we could talk a lot about the theology of chosenness here, but in this Midrash, I think the frame is to feel a sense of being loved and being in relationship with God. Now, obviously, we may not always feel particularly confident about being in that relationship. And in fact, rather than feeling like we are loved, we might feel particularly downtrodden, and even, in terms of the language of this verse, even oppressed by all of those nations. So we're going to look at a theme here that's a little bit, I don't know, it's maybe a little bit depressing, but I think will allow us to open up a lot more dimensions of this love story. Another explanation comes after the 4 that you've seen. Ani chavatzalet Hasharon. Ani hiva chaviva ani. I am she, and beloved am I. Ani hi shahayiti chavuya udimusa, or perhaps rimusa, bitzilan shel malchuyot. I am the one who is hidden and trampled in the shadow of kingdoms. I am the one who is hidden and trampled in the shadow of kingdoms. And that's kind of all that the Midrash needs to say to move us from this historical / mythic telling of the story in the past to the present moment. Malchuyot, kingdoms, it probably is a reference to the kingdoms described in the book of Daniel, that includes, as the sort of latest kingdom, the Romans and the Christian Empire. But the generality of it, I think, is meant to bring us into the present moment. Whatever it is that might make us feel hidden or trampled, just feeling like we're in the shadow where that shadow is dark and that shadow is heavy, right? Here that's in a political context, not having sovereignty, being in exile under other kingdoms. But I think what I hope can be one intention that we have in this Midrash is whatever it might be that is feeling like chavuya betzel, being hidden and suppressed under the dark, heavy shadow of something, whatever that is somehow meant to be paired with a strong sense of confidence and reassurance and comfort of feeling beloved, chaviv. And that's not simple. That's not simple at all, right? I think it's more likely that we might feel abandoned or lonely as we have a sense of that shadow and feeling hidden and trampled. But this is where this Midrash goes. Lemachar, literally tomorrow, probably means in the future, but literally tomorrow, which gives a sense of optimism and hope here. Tomorrow, when the Holy One redeems me from the shadow of kingdoms, I will thrive like a lily, ani martevet keshoshana, reciting to God a new song, as it says, sing to God a new song, for God has done wonders. God's right hand and holy arm won victory. Shir l'Adonai shir chadash ki niflaot asa hoshia lo yamino uzra kodsho. From Psalms we recite in Kabbalat Shabbat. Okay, so here's our trajectory where this isn't just about the past, the kind of arc that you've seen in each of your sessions, going from a sense of feeling trampled or hidden to thriving, right, being a sort of studded with good deeds is the phrase that you saw over and over with Ma'asim Tovim, and the expressive quality of being able to recite a new song. So going from a sense of being kind of compressed or repressed to expressive. That is the trajectory that this midrash imagines we can go through ourselves in our own moment. And that's really, right, that gets us back to our first class together in this format, the arc of the Seder from Genut to Shevach, starting with the negative stuff, the dark stuff, and being able to go from there to a more generous and a more kind of improved posture and position. That's the arc that we are trying to go through in our Seder each year. Okay, so that's our last scene of this style, in the shade of, or the shadow of the kingdoms. Now we're going to look at, the Midrash continues in less of a tight structure, but still based on these same words, Chavatzela Tasharon, and the theme of Chaviva, feeling beloved. And we're going to see in the next passages that we look together more language around how we somehow interweave a sense of feeling compressed and repressed with a sense of feeling beloved. And I hope that what you got out of your learning together, and what we'll see unfold even more now, is that the idea of being in relationship with God, the idea of being in the depths of this relationship with God, is that it is something that draws us out. So not only in terms of Israel as a nation getting redeemed, but I hope you can also relate to this personally, and some of the questions were designed to get at this in the learning, how our relationship with God, and if we are ready to be open to deep relationship in our life, is hopefully something that can reach us when we are feeling stuck, and bring us into a greater sense of expression and knowing ourselves, right, voice and deed. And I think it's just a really important frame to have on how we think about our relationship with God, not just as the commander of mitzvot or a sort of transcendent authority figure of some sort, though that might all be there as well in how we think about our relationship with the divine. But there's a different quality that we might be able to cultivate in our relationship, and a different complexity, and maybe also a different kind of long-term perspective on what it means to be in relationship with God, if we think about that relationship as something that can always reach us wherever it is that we are feeling hidden, untrampled, and draw us out into a posture that is more about thriving and expression. Okay, so we'll look at this next piece here. Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana said, the congregation of Israel said before the Holy Blessed One, I am she, and I am beloved. Anihi v'chaviva ani. This might be so repetitive, but remember that this is the key of what the rabbis do to the poetry of the Song of Songs that has no specific context or setting, right? Applying that to Israel and God is the main message of a lot of Midrash, though we'll actually see a different interpretation a little bit later. Okay, Israel says, for I am placed in the depths of troubles, be'imkei hatzarot. I'm placed in the depth of troubles. And when the Holy Blessed One draws me out from the troubles, kishayidleini mehatzarot, I am succulent or luscious with good deeds like a lily, and recite a song before God. That is why it is written, God in stress, they sought you. Hashem batzar pakducha. Okay, so here we have, I would say in some ways, a kind of general theme that doesn't pin down this expression to any moment, not to any of the four scenes that you saw, not to being under the shadow of the kingdoms. This is separated from any kind of history, or a specific story, and it's just narrating the experience that you saw and the arc that you saw in all of your sessions, being in the depths of troubles, being drawn out, becoming succulent with good deeds, or dew-studded with good deeds, like a lily, and to this place of reciting a song, shir, like Sharon. And I am curious, because I actually don't think that anything that you saw fleshed this out in any greater detail specifically. I am curious what you made of this line, I am succulent with good deeds, or I am studded with good deeds. Ani martevet ma'asim tovim. If you think of lilies of the valley and the little white flowers, and then also the idea seems to be that these plants are sort of always green and lush, and being covered with good deeds in a similar way. It's not necessarily what you would imagine as part of this story of redemption, right? You might think of Israel is in trouble, God steps in, redeems them, they sing. What did you make about this middle part of this arc about good deeds? I would be so happy to see anything in the chat, or hear if somebody wants to raise their hand, what you did with that phrase that you saw repeatedly in all of your sessions. Okay. I see a hand. I'm gonna ask you to unmute, but your name is covered up. Your last name is Dallin, but I can't actually see your first name.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. We took from the Hebrew word the hartiv as the idea of that we're wetting the soil, that it's being fertilized with our good deeds. And so it's actually giving us an action to do, that our good deeds can open up possibilities for other things like fertile soil.
Okay. Thank you so much for that image. And yes, I think this is something where you might not have expected this kind of initiative or description of the sort of action on the part of Israel as part of this story. But here we see that there is a role for Israel's action even in this story of being redeemed by God. And I like this idea that those good deeds aren't only about those good deeds themselves, but can actually create fertile ground for further sustenance or growth. Okay. We're getting a great comment here about succulent in the chat. Any other thoughts people had about that middle phrase, good deeds, being succulent or wet or thriving with good deeds, and where that fit into this story of going from a place of trouble to song and expression? Okay, we're seeing a comment that maybe this is about the beauty of mitzvot. Okay, I hope you'll continue thinking about this part. Oh, Brad, did you have a response? Good deeds, what is this about?
Yeah, yes, I believe that no good deeds goes unrewarded. So here's a quick example. I retired as a military chaplain. When I retired, the person who retired me told me that when I was on my first tour, someone came in, he was contemplating suicide. Somehow I resolved the issue. 30 years later, I found out he had made senior chief, had a family, and he remembered me specifically because of what I did. I took the time to talk him out of some sort of issue. I don't even remember this guy at all. Couldn't pick him out of a lineup if my life depended on it. The point being that good deed, my time listening to him, and I have heard hundreds of stories, changed his life. He has a family. He made Master Chief, which is a very high rank, an enlisted rank, and So I fertilized the ground for his career and whatever he did in the Navy. So there's a
Okay.
very
Thank you so much for that story. It's also an example of there's so many people in this Zoom room and so many more chavrutas, and I hope that you all brought your stories into your learning as well. Okay, but I think that was also a powerful example of it might be within our own hands to catalyze this process of redemption expression. It could be that part of the idea of the Ma'asim Tovim here, and not any one specific action, but just being open and ready to engage in Ma'asim Tovim. That's our part of this story. And sometimes we might not even think that those are particularly significant, but they could lead to something that actually results in redemption. I appreciate also the comment in the chat that Ma'asim Tovim, those are doing the mitzvot, and it's not exactly the same word. That's a little bit of a tricky thing about Ma'asim Tovim. Is that just generally good deeds, or is that specifically mitzvot? Is it specifically deeds that are more like chesed and more interpersonal rather than just ritual? A lot of questions about what that phrase means, and you had nothing in your text to draw that out, so I just wanted to hear that from you. But maybe that's our way of expressing love to God. Okay, so that what we have here is actually two different ways that we express our love to God. If God expresses love to us by drawing us out of whatever those dark places might be that we are in, the way we express our love is both by actions and by song in these texts, not just one or the other. Okay, thanks for sharing those thoughts. I was curious and know that you had opportunity to think through that a number of times. Okay, that is our seeking God in stress and in the depths. All right, we'll look at one other part of this piece that I think is actually, it's just quite beautiful and gets to the idea of this love song and this quite intimate relationship between us and God. Rav Acha said, the congregation of Israel said, at the time that you set your gaze deeply upon me, I am succulent with good deeds like a lily, and recite a song. B'sha'ah she'at ma'amik einecha bi. B'sha'ah she'at ma'amik einecha bi. Right, when you, God, have your eyes turned deeply to me. So think of sort of this mutual gaze of lovers, right? God, when you look at me deeply, then I become wet or succulent with good deeds and recite this song. What is the basis for that? Shir ha'ma'alot mima'akim kiraticha Hashem, a psalm of ascents. From the depths I called out to you. And here, from the depths, isn't necessarily dark, sort of dark depths, but mima'amakim, from the depth of your gaze. From the depth of your gaze at me, God, I am able to call out to you. And I think that this is a sort of beautiful example of the kind of mutuality where, again, that sort of deep gaze of lovers towards each other, that is how we're describing God in this scene. And I hope, just to reiterate, or one of the final points of your last session and thinking about us sheltering God was the mutuality of relationship. This isn't only a story about God sheltering us, it's also a story about us sheltering and making space for God. Okay, these are some of our more beautiful moments that, again, aren't tied to a specific moment in the story, but bring out these themes a little bit more generally. Then our Midrash takes a fairly dark turn that I think is actually worth spending some time on, especially in this year. The sages said, the congregation of Israel said this verse. They said, I am the one and I am beloved. Ani hi v'chaviva ani. What did that mean? For I am placed in the depths of hell. Ani netuna b'imkei gehenom. I am placed in the depths of hell. And we'll go on to see how this becomes beautiful. But I think the intensity of that, right? It's not just chavuya b'tzel. I'm sort of sensing that I'm in the shadow of something that feels a little bit dark and heavy. This is when we feel like we're really at the lowest of the low. B'imkei gehenom. That's where we might be when it's time to have some sort of relationship with God. Right? When the Holy Blessed One will redeem me from its depths, as it's written in Psalms, he lifted me out of the miry pit. Vaya'alini mi bor sha'on. When God lifts me out of these depths, then we have our refrain, I will be succulent with good deeds and recite a song. Okay, based on another verse about song, Veitain befi shir chadash, that is following that verse in Psalms. Okay. Again, there's kind of nothing new about the arc and story being told here. You've seen this over and over again, and I will just share a little bit on the literary structure of Midrash and how it works. You can have, and I hope you're feeling this, a kind of inundation of repetition about what a particular phrase means. It's kind of like slam poetry, I guess. That Daniel Boyarin, who's a scholar of rabbinic literature and has written on Midrash and modes of Midrash, it calls paradigmatic. It's a paradigmatic Midrash, meaning it's pointing to a verse in the Bible, in this case, our verse about the flowers, and it's saying, this verse is this, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's this. It's all of these different things. They're just a list of different associations for this one verse and phrase. And we are left to hold all of those together in a kind of composite way that is hopefully generative to try to put all these interpretations together. So I think maybe more than other years, this description that doesn't shy away from describing the intensity of an experience that we might be having, right? To feel like we're actually in the depths of hell, b'imkei gehenom, as somewhere that is nonetheless has some kind of possibility of taking our relationship with God to a new place, right? The idea that God can actually reach us even in those ultimate depths, and bring us into the same modes of expression, right? The good deeds, action, expression through action, and also the song, Shira. Okay. Now, I want to jump from that part of our Midrash to a less comforting part of this story, right? So we've just gone from, well, even if we're in the depths of hell, we can still describe the same beautiful story of possibility where if we are open to divine relationship, and in some ways what I hope you're seeing is what it means to be open to divine relationship, to relationship with God, where who knows who God is and what it means to be in a relationship with God. What this Midrash is saying it means to be in a relationship with God is being able to go from the depths to a sense of feeling redeemed and to a posture of expression. We're going to see here a counter narrative to that theme. And it's a little bit harsh, but important nonetheless. Okay. The sage's approach, it's like the approach of Rabbi Elazar HaModai, who gives us the following scene of what will happen in the end of days. And it's a scene, instead of comfort, it's a scene that's a little bit more of terror, though has its own comforting side. In future times, the leaders of the nations of the world will come and prosecute Israel before the Holy One, saying the following. So at the end of days, we are going to be put on the defense as other nations are acting as a prosecutor against us before God. And this is what they're going to say. Ribono shel olam, master of the universe. Elo avdu avodat kochavim, ve'elo avdu avodat kochavim. Well, these people worshipped idols, the other nations, and these people worshipped idols, meaning Israel. Elu galu arayot, ve'elu galu arayot. Elu shafchu damim, ve'elu shafchu damim. These ones violated major sexual taboos, and so did these, Israel. These, all these other people, these other nations, spilled blood. They committed acts of murder. And so did these. So did Israel. Meaning, there is nothing to differentiate Israel from any of the other nations, right? This is a counter narrative to the opening line we saw, where we have a sense of confidence of being beloved and being chosen, right? This scene in the Midrash has a sense of a sort of nightmare. And it's also a nightmare that's rooted in our own experience or self-perception of guilt and inadequacy, where basically what's happening in this text is we're describing Israel ourselves as being the worst possible people. Okay, so the Midrash then goes on to ask, why are these descending to hell and these are not? Right? Why do these people, these other nations, go to hell, and these, Israel, does not go to hell? Why do they get to be redeemed? Okay, wherever you are on the kind of eschatology, and hell probably doesn't exist, and certainly there's the like particularist aspect of this, of being chosen while all the other nations are going to hell. Obviously, there's like a lot there theologically, but I hope what you will take from this is the way in which this scene is so different than the rest of this Midrash, where suddenly we don't have that confidence of feeling like we should be loved. We don't have this confidence of coming into a self-expression of good deeds and our song to God. Instead, we are just right, imagining this is being projected into the mouths of the other nations, but really expresses our own self-doubt at our worthiness of being redeemed. Okay, I'm gonna stop the share, though I realize that you all could have gone on and read the rest already, but just before we go on to read the rest together, any thoughts on where the Midrash might go with this, or from this place of realization, a sense of self-doubt that we may not be worthy at all of being redeemed? What might the response to this be? I'd be happy to hear responses in the chat. And I don't think this is something you saw fully in the passages that you learned together. Okay, so Brit, we're saying maybe the idea is there's a covenant. It's not really about us as individuals, what we deserve. The question of adequacy isn't the story. There's a covenant, there's a larger story, and we're just part of that. Okay, Brit could be a very strong kind of response. We're seeing also, we're definitely seeing in all of these texts a real sense of being in a world that is difficult, a world that might feel extremely heavy or dark or oppressive. And what we see in this particular passage, unlike the rest, is like we might not feel super confident about finding our way in that world towards good deeds and song. We might get lost in the mess of that world, and we might get swept up in the mess and in the kind of negativity of that world. Okay, so one response here is Brit. We're gonna see where this Midrash goes. That's not actually gonna be about everything's fine because there's a larger covenant. It's gonna be a different story. Okay, So let's look at this together. Okay, grace. Another option is grace, right? That this is an act of chesed from God. God will redeem us even if we don't deserve it. So this is going to go in a bit of a different direction. Here we go. This is God's response to those angels and their accusations against us. Oops, sorry. Okay, here we go. The Holy Blessed One will respond, saying, if so, if it's true that everybody is actually all the same and has done terrible things and isn't worthy of anything except going to hell, if so, all nations shall go down to hell with their gods. If that's where everybody needs to go, then that's where they're going to go. And they're going to take their gods with them. That is why it is written, for all peoples walk each in the names of its gods. Okay, this is a quote from Micah, which I gave you on the bottom, from Sefer Micha. Ki kol ha'amim yelchu ish b'shem Elohav, va'anachnu nelech b'shem Adonai Eloheinu le'olam va'ed. So the point of this verse, in its pshat, in the literal sense, seems to be making a contrast. All those other people walk in the names of their gods, but we walk in the name of our God forever and ever. That seems to be triumphant. In our midrash, that's a little bit more of a defeat, right? God says, if everybody's really so terrible, then all the nations are going to go to Gehinnom with their gods. Okay, and then it gets to be a little bit more intense because we see that is true of us too. This isn't a story of redemption. You deserve to be redeemed. No, instead, the story, as Rabbi Richman said, were it not written, it would be impossible to say. He's going to say something that seems so radical, you would have never thought to say it. But the Tanakh, the Bible, seems to say it itself. So we do have permission to imagine this. It says, for God is judged in fire. Ki ba'esh Hashem nishpat. God is judged in fire. This is Isaiah in one of the sort of scenes of judgment. A bit of an apocalyptic scene here. God is judged in fire. God judges is not written here. And it doesn't say that God is actively judging others who are being judged in fire, even though that is probably what the verse means in its own context. But rather, it says, is judged. It's in the passive. God is judged. God is being judged. So what does this mean when you put these together? It means that if Israel is so bad that we need to go to Gehinnom, to hell, we aren't worthy of being redeemed, then just like everybody else who's going to Gehinnom with their God, we will also be going to Gehinnom, and we'll be going there with our God, who is God. So God is also going down to Gehinnom and to hell in this passage. Okay, it's sort of intense, but I think kind of helpful to name, and maybe sometimes maps onto more of our experience of the world, which is not always the beauty of those two flowers, and going from the darkness to the beauty of our deeds and our song, but actually feeling like we're going down, the world around us is going down, and we're bringing God down with us. Sort of all's going to hell in this scene of the world. And it's possible we may have moments in our lives, and maybe especially moments this year, where we may have felt like this in the depths of troubles, and that God is sort of sucked into that too, that any kind of redemptive quality of our relationship with God might not be able to fully withstand and hold up in the intensity of the mess around us. Now, how do we know that this is happening, that God is going down with us? Because we have a verse that may be extremely familiar from Psalm 23, Gam ki elech begeitz hamavet Lo irara ki ata imadi, right? Even as I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear evil, for you are with me. That's not just sort of like a comforting you are with me, though clearly it's meant to convey some comfort. It's also speaking very explicitly in this midrash about God being really exiled to Gehinnom with everyone else in the world. So I bring this to you as a sort of dark counter narrative to the rhythm and trope of beauty and redemption that we've seen until now in our passages. And I would be curious to hear if there are any thoughts on this in the chat, or if somebody would like to unmute and respond. Having this idea, I would say in the scenes that you saw, the language for what's happening here would be, I was in the shadow feeling trampled, and instead of emerging from that, God is going there with me, right? Sort of God descending into that state of mind, into that experience. Sometimes we don't have that capacity for our relationship with God to bring us out of that. We are so stuck in that. All we can do is be open to God being there as well. Yeah, Howard.
I must admit that the lover concept that seemed so beautiful when I signed up for the course, when it forced me to think in those terms, when I looked at a God who first thing he does when he connects with us is remove us from our family and from our community, move us somewhere where we'll be all by ourselves with only God. No longer do we have our supporting. Continues to do things to us that are not terribly nice, including saying we're going to be 200 years in slavery, this long before anyone's done anything. And when he finally gets us out and we get to Sinai, he does what any abuser does. He sets a series of rules for us to follow, whether we like it or not. And if we don't follow them, we're in serious trouble. And this is something that came to me as I began to look at it, a different way of viewing it. A second related point is that this relationship of lovers or of married couple is strictly the traditional non-egalitarian husband is ruler mode of a relationship, not the one that most of us follow now, which is an egalitarian marriage. So unfortunately, this beautiful metaphors that you gave us, much of which I still find beautiful, also brought up this very negative feeling.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for that comment. I think that kind of comment and perspective is in many ways, I think that's very real and very, and very present in these sources. And I would add is in some ways, some of the motivation that I had and have around designing this kind of class and sort of course and trajectory is knowing that this material can be read that way, that the way that we think about our relationship with God can often sort of be a projection of some of the worst aspects of how power dynamics can play out in our own world and certainly throughout history. Right? What does it take to be able to open up some alternative meanings in these texts? So I appreciate your comment, Howard, because I think, especially your comment at this moment in the class, I don't know if you meant to connect it to this part of the class that's like, actually everybody's going to hell and God's going to hell with us too. It's sort of the nightmare scene and a sense of how much everything is falling apart. I actually think your comment plays into that very, in a very meaningful way, where we can sense in these texts, and maybe in these texts as a reflection of the world around us, how much things can feel abusive, oppressive, like they're falling apart. And I guess what I hope could be drawn out from the class and from the Shir HaShirim angle, where I do think that Shir HaShirim is one of the more egalitarian poems of love in the Tanakh. You can't even always tell which speaker is speaking because they say similar things to an extent. Right? The question is, what does it look like theologically to like reread, work with the material we have, and do this work of naming and building up a relationship of mutuality and mutual support and a mutual sense of real subjectivity and having greater voice and expression through our relationship with God and in our relationships with others. And that's where I do think the theme in this midrash that is about redemption, that brings us to greater expression in action and greater expression in voice, is one really critical part of this midrashic arc. It's not just about being rescued and saved in the sort of damsel in distress and the kind of manipulative ways that can be deployed. It's about seeing ourselves and our subjectivity and what we can do in the world more fully and hearing our voice more fully, right? I do think that is there with the expression in deed, ma'asim tovim, and expression in voice this year. So, and I will say, right, I think the other piece that I hope got fleshed out a little bit in the course was the that final scene that you looked at, where we are building shelter for God, and God, right, and sort of that's parallel to God building shelter for us, also catapults us towards more of a relationship of mutuality. But I hear it, and I think that risk of abuse and manipulation in that story that can be there, and our work is to transform that. Anne, go ahead.
The way I see this whole section that we're just talking about, for me, it's tremendous. There's a lot of mutuality. It's that when I am in my darkest moment, maybe God isn't going to lift me up out of it, but God will be walking with me. It's almost like an empathetic joining together. When I know someone is suffering and there's nothing I can do for them, sometimes simply being with them, walking with them in their darkness makes it more livable. It's part of being alive in this world. And so in my most difficult moments, that song has allowed me to keep going. I mean, quite literally in my own life, that psalm read to me on the phone allowed me to keep going and to take one step in front of the other and keep going. Not so much that I have dragged God down, but that God is with me all the time, no matter where I am. And that's what I take from this. So I don't see this as negative at all. Mm-hmm. I don't see it as dragging God down any more than I see a beloved friend who doesn't want to tell me their troubles because they don't want me to suffer. Well, I want to walk with them. I love them. So I want to walk by their side as they suffer. Doesn't mean I'm going to be torn to pieces by that. So this is how I read this. And it helps me understand that it's not so much about the magic thinking that God is going to come in and magically from God's high place lift me up, which would be this very strong hierarchical position, but rather God is always by my side. Anyway, that's how I see it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that it's a beautiful reading of this passage, and in many ways, I think what's difficult about the beginning of this passage is how much it's steeped in a sense of guilt, right? All the bad things that we do. I think in some ways the earlier passage we saw of just, well, here we are, we're found in trouble, in the depths of trouble. In some ways it's helpful to read these passages alongside each other, where maybe it's that we're in the depths of trouble, but instead of the kind of beauty and maybe sometimes not quite imaginable arc that you saw in each scene of going from there, like, to good deeds, to singing a song, right? Well, that's great, but maybe we don't always feel like we have the capacity to do that. That's just too much to expect. And so what you see in this scene is actually something that may feel more realistic in some ways, which is a sense of God being there with us, even if we're still feeling pretty darn stuck where we are. And that's a source of comfort. Okay. I want to go from, I want to point out that it's pretty remarkable for this midrash to find that sense of comfort in this verse in Isaiah, seeing this as God being judged in fire, because the whole point of this passage in its literal context in Isaiah is about God judging everybody else with fire and God's anger and God's sword, and sort of God in that mode of that divine wrath that we see so often in Tanakh. For the rabbis to reinterpret that as, no, God is right there in hell with everybody else, is actually like an even more remarkable leap. And I think, as you were saying, Anne, it sort of brings us to a sense of companionship with God, even when things are looking and feeling pretty bad. Okay. We'll just do the final parts of this midrash, and then I have one closing exercise for us. There's running with this Psalm 23, there's a reading of what is it exactly that brings us comfort in these times of trouble, and even really intense trouble of feeling like we're in the depths of hell, right? We have Shivtecha, based on that verse in Psalm 23. Shivtecha, your rod, these are the troubles or afflictions. Mishantecha, your staff, this is the Torah. Okay? So we have these two ways of feeling like God is with us. And one of them, I think, points to Howard's point about, is this an abusive God who's afflicting or abusing the one that they are in relationship with? You could have that reading, though I think this is really starting from a place of trying to understand the troubles that we might find ourselves in and somehow feel like we're in relationship with God nonetheless. But we see here also that the Torah is actually something that can bring us comfort in these times. And the Midrash asks, they comfort me. Could it be without troubles? Could it be that we can actually have a sense of comfort without any troubles at all, that it's just sort of a placid relationship with God that's only about comfort? No. The verse has the word ach, only. And only the rabbis always interpret as being some kind of exclusion or exception, meaning we might find comfort, find comfort in Torah, but it's not going to be without any trouble, any afflictions, any complexity at all. And I hope that one thing that you saw over the course of these sessions is that complexity of that language of being in the shadow, and bringing in that shadow, whatever that might be, integrating that into our relationship with God, that is what these texts envision, not just a kind of totally, hearts and roses picture of this relationship with God. So this is going to be complex. And I would say, instead of reading this through Howard's lens of, does that mean that this God is somehow abusive or manipulative? I don't think that's how you have to read this here. I think that this is just naming the reality of the world, which is it's gonna have some difficulties in it. There's gonna be hard stuff. And that doesn't mean that God is somehow gone, right? That is gonna be integrated into this relationship. Now, right, the other part of this midrash is, could it be that we fully have this sense of comfort in this world? And the midrash says, no, it's only going to be essentially in the world to come, the length of days. So there's both this confidence of comfort and a sense of mitigated comfort, right? There's also going to be difficulty and trouble, and a sense of deferred comfort. And I think in some ways this just paints some of what we saw in those earlier texts in a way that is maybe a little bit more realistic and sets an expectation that may feel more realistic in integrating all of these different and sometimes darker pieces together. Okay, I want to look at the next part of this midrash, which has a totally different reading of our verse. Chavatzelet. Who is the one who says, Ani hi v'chaviva, Ani, I am she and beloved am I? It's not Israel. It's the earth. Aretz. Okay? So just so you're aware, the way the rabbis read the Song of Songs isn't as monolithic as it's always about Israel and God. Right, sometimes there are other readings of the Song of Songs here. So here we have, the land said this verse. The land said this verse. It said, I am she and beloved am I. For all of the dead of the world are hidden in me. Shekol metei ha'olam chavuyin bi. So it's a pun. It's a play on that root that we have chavatzelet, chet bet, that can mean something like beloved, and it can mean something like hidden. And I just want to say that I don't know that it's sort of an obvious thing that the earth would feel like it's beloved by virtue of the fact that it gets to hold the dead. And I think, again, in reflecting on this year and what's the chapter of the story that we need to tell this year at our Passover Seder about the next stage of this relationship that we are in with God, the idea of taking note of the many dead who are hidden in the earth now, to think of the earth as having a certain kind of role that it sort of sees, and it seems like it's kind of honored to have this role of getting to hold the dead, even as it is so sad that there are the dead, right? This is, I think, an interesting moment to linger on in this midrash. Shekol metei ha'olam chavuyin bi, all of the dead of the world are hidden in me. And the way the story goes when it's the earth speaking is that the earth then says, when the Holy One asks for them back, thinking to the ultimate redemption, I will return them, says the earth. I will be succulent with good deeds like a lily, ma'asim tovim, kashoshana, and recite a song before God. As it says, miknaf haaretz zimirot shamanu, from the end of the earth we hear singing. So we have here references to Isaiah, to a vision of ultimate redemption. And we don't read this passage on Passover, but on the 8th day of Passover, we do kind of look ahead to Messianic times and the lion and the lamb. And this passage here in the Midrash jumps to this image of ultimate redemption where there will be the movement from death to life. And in some ways, I think that the language of this midrash and framing that, just like it's framed every other act of redemption as coming into being like the lily of the valley and the rose of Sharon, that's about being succulent and thriving with good deeds and singing the song, right? It sees every moment of coming back to life that spring represents in so many ways. And that I think also we could internalize, right? Any way in which there was a part of us that was buried or hidden, and we find a way for that to come back to life and to expression, right? That is all kind of coterminous. It's all part of this story of of redemption. It's all a piece of this kind of redemption, and that is the story that we are trying to tell each year at Passover, right? Can we look back at this year? Can we notice all of the dead that were hidden? Can we notice all of the ways in which we might be holding something that has felt buried or hidden in ourselves and in our lives, and turn towards feeling a little bit more alive and expressive? Okay, I want to close with the last thing here, which is just about pointing out something that you may have thought about in this class, which is that there are two different flowers in our verse in the Song of Songs. There's two different flowers. There's Chavatzalet HaSharon, the rose of Sharon, and there's Shoshanat Ha'amakim, the lily of the valley. And this is a very simple midrash. Rabbi Yudan said, I am a rose of Sharon. All he says is, a rose of Sharon is not a lily of the valley, right? This verse puts both of them together, but they're two different things. They're two different things. And I want to close with this image, and then I'll give you one prompt in the chat. Rather, what's the point of these two flowers here? All the while that she is small, he calls her Rose of Sharon. When she grows up, he calls her Lily of the Valley. Okay? Kozman she ktana, he kore ota chavatzalet, hu kore ota chavatzalet. Higdila kore ota shoshana. Right? The point is, we have a story here of movement and of growth that's really going from one of these flowers to the other. And then it gives you the general refrain that you saw in Alvei Midrashim. Why is it called a rose of Sharon, Chavatzalet? Because she is hidden in shade, Chavuya B'tzila. So at the end of the day, sort of close with this general picture here, where I hope what you got to experience in this class and in all of these scenes was a sense of the dynamic nature of our relationship with God, and the way in which all of these scenes that touch on these different formative moments in that relationship can help to draw out and articulate various aspects of growth. And that our work this year at the Seder, like every year, is to think about that journey from Chavatzalet HaSharon to Shoshanat Ha'amakim, right? From feeling hidden, something that's felt buried, to a greater form or sense of expression and confidence in expression. So I just want to close by asking you to share in the chat if there is anything that struck you, or any hint of this kind of arc and trajectory of growth that you are taking from this class. Something that you may have seen in the text, a way that you're thinking about relationship with God, a way you might be thinking about relationship in general. Is there some way that you can point to and name an image of growth from this hiddenness to greater expression? I'm going to have us spend this last minute with people sharing these in chat. We'll listen to the song from the Song of Songs, and then I'll wish everybody a Chag Sameach.
בחגבי הסלע יונתי רגע יונתי הריני את מרייך השמיעיני את קולך כי קולך עורף ומעריך נאווה היי לי 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 da 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 da
Thank you so much for these responses, for embarking on this learning. And I hope that part of the goal was seeing these many different moments in this relationship with God and being able to integrate them, but also maybe there's one particular scene that you may feel like, yes, I need to like latch onto that this year and think about that as I tell my next chapter. So wishing you all a Chag Sameach. I hope it's a great Seder night, whatever form that takes. And thank you for sharing in this learning with me and with each other. Chag Sameach.
בסתר המאי